Hello and welcome to Advocata's Reset Now podcast. I'm Anuka, your host for the day, and with me I have our guest speaker, K.D Vimanga. Vimanga is an independent policy and a political analyst. He is actively working with many public policy engagements and advocacy work. His area of expertise ranges from inclusive development to economic and policy research. It's a pleasure to have you on board, Vimanga.
Thank you, Anuka. It's a pleasure to be on the podcast.
Yes. So to begin with, this is a new year, 2023, and we have passed a year of economic crisis. 2022, I don't think that anybody would forget the difficulties, the hardships that Sri Lankans, we faced. Long queues for fuel stations and gas stations, and then long hours of power cuts, food shortages, shortages of medicine, and the list goes on. So this economic crisis has necessarily taken a burden. It has been a burden to most of us. So this is a new year, and with the dawn of this new year, I think many Sri Lankans has a lot of resolutions. And one main resolution is the economic prosperity and the development of the country. So, as Winston Churchill once mentioned, that a good crisis should never go to waste. We need to make use of the crisis and do the reforms as necessary. So, when talking about economic reforms, we need to look at our Asian peers, specifically talking about the Indian and the Thailand examples, and make sure that we also implement the structural and the much needed economic reforms. But at this critical juncture of Sri Lanka's economy, we need to face this with hope and positivity. So that is why, on the dawn of the new year, we decided to talk about reforms and the way forward of the Sri Lankan economy. So, in order to start with reforms, there is an argument about the reforms that Sri Lanka is focusing on is the ones that are recommended by the International Monetary Fund or the IMF. So, I would like to direct this question to Vimanga. What do you think about this argument that we are following only the IMF recommendations, or is it the are these the necessary reforms that we need for Sri Lanka as a country, or is it just the IMF recommended reforms?
Thank you, Anuka. I think you've set the context right. Uh, but I think before I answer your question, I'll take a cue with what you said about last year. I think, uh, the economic debacle that we are in is a consequence of policy failure that has existed from the time of independence, right? And I think the climax of that was last year. So if we're going to look at 2023, I think our priority as a nation, again, is identifying what our real priorities are in the policy and economic landscape. And I am absolutely not sure whether we are there as both as people as well as a nation. But I think we should definitely understand our priorities. Now, one of those priorities is the IMF program, which currently is being negotiated, and there is a lot of different arguments, contexts, contestations around it. But I think if I was to directly approach your question, then my sense is no, this IMF program has to be a program of the people, right? These condition or people, I mean, these conditionalities or supposed conditionalities that you see are really the reforms that the nation needs. It's not that the IMF imposes conditionalities just because it sees and tells nation that you should do it, but they make these recommendations because this is what the fundamentally the country needs, right? So I think as a nation and as a people, we need to make this IMF program our last IMF program for sure, because we've had consecutive IMF programs which have not seen conclusion. But we need to make it our program. These reforms need to become our reforms, because only by implementing these reforms can you come out of this economic debacle The crisis that you saw, the hardships that you faced over last year will continue if these reforms are not done. um, and in my sense is, again, it's a two-step process, right? You have immediate reforms, and then you have secondary reforms, which I will explore as this conversation goes on. And I think Advocata has been speaking on these for the past 2.5 years. So, directly answering your question, this IMF program has to be our program, a program of the Sri Lankan people, and we need to complete this IMF program if we are going to come out of this crisis.
Yes, of course, Vimanga. I think that is a consensus that most of us has to come upon. And also speaking about the reform, since you brought this argument up, I think we've been working on, as Advocata, we've been working on the state-owned enterprise reform for some time. And also that is an important reform that has been brought up throughout the year of 2022. And I'm very sure that we will see some fruition of it in 2023 at 2023. So the state-owned enterprise reform is mostly debated and also is brought into argument because of the burden that state-owned enterprises has on our public finances. Again, directing another question to you, Vimanga, what is your take on the success of state-owned enterprise reforms?
So, Anuka, I think you can also add on to this because you were part of the SOE project and you have a lot of insights. But I think it is way too early to say whether we have not even started our SOE reforms. We don't even know when we will start these reforms. So I think the real importance is getting the nation prepared and getting our people prepared to implement these reforms, right? Building consensus within our communities. And that has to be the message that politicians, policymakers, individuals take to their communities. That these reforms, like SOEs, are essential reforms because they are the only reforms that can lead the country towards growth. Now, there's this whole wider narrative that, right, we have this IMF program, it'll bring in a sense of, macroeconomic stabilization, right? So, macroeconomic stabilization is what we need at the moment. It is the dire need. But can we just stick on that sense of stabilization? No, because we need to come out of it. And the only way we can come out of it is growth, is by achieving economic growth. And how do you do that? One of the key components is reforming state-owned enterprises, and you can call that whole liberalization process a growth accelerator, right? So for sure, if we need to look not just next 2023, but we need to look beyond for the next 5-10 years, and the starting point probably is SOE reforms. So what we really need to do is start that reforming process. And again, I must, it is important that we highlight and tell our people that you need to support these reforms, that you need to support getting rid this for the state to get rid of being a commercial player. Another key reason why we are in this crisis is because the state has been performing the activities of businesses, running enterprises which have accrued losses, which in turn have contributed to the nation being indebted. So I think what is essential is building a sense of message, a sense of consensus among our people that these are essential reforms. And I think policymakers have a lot to do in that sense.
Yes, of course, like you said, but also I would like to highlight few things that happened in 2022 with the interim budget. It was proposed that a SOE restructuring unit will be formed, and I think the committee is active, and also they are looking into several options. And also in the 2023 budget, we saw that five commercial SOEs were brought into conversation, and the process of divestment and restructuring was discussed. So I think these are positive things that we as Sri Lankans can look forward for, because otherwise our business environment or the economic condition of the country might face a threat with the ongoing crisis and with the ongoing economic downturn. So it's important that we focus on the SOE reforms, the state-owned enterprise reforms, as Vimanga said. So the main problem with our SOEs is, according to my opinion, is that we run in a lot of sectors. looking at banking and finance and insurance, and to from banking and finance to insurance to tourism and also to retail businesses. The state is involved in many of these things. But the real problem is, are these SOEs making real profits? Are these SOEs adding to the economy? But if these businesses are necessarily making losses, is there any value addition to the economy? If not, are they only burdening the state coffers, and also is it only a burden on our public finances and thereby the taxpayer? So that is the necessary thing that we all need to think about and initiate and create the initiative for SOE reform. So if you really think about this thing, I think not only our policymakers, but also the general public will be convinced that yes, we need to reform our SOEs. We need to go for state owned enterprise reforms. I think the best example is Sri Lankan Airlines. For From 2008 onwards, the losses it has been racking up has exceeded billions of amounts by now. So, and also the debt racked up on their accounts has also exceeded a significant amount. But also, we saw that at the same time, when Sri Lankan Airlines was facing the same situation, Air India was also going through a similar financial situation. But after the COVID 19 crisis, India decided to go for a privatization. So, what do you think is what we could learn from this experience of India?
I think you've tackled the question, and I think you brought the conversation to a very important point, right? Now, what I would initially, like to say is, I think we've been, going around the mulberry bush around this concept of whether these SOEs are important, whether SOEs being led by the government is important, right? I think it is a proven, I mean, global examples exist that the more the government gets rid of their state-owned enterprises, the more growth they will see. Vietnam, where we now like all economists in this country, and everyone's talking about Vietnam, because it definitely has great examples for sure. But if we were emulating Vietnam, then we would have got rid of our SOEs in 2005. Vietnam brought in the initial action plan, which started, I believe, with about 40 SOEs back in 2004, 2005, right? And today you see the amount of growth Vietnam has achieved just by getting rid of about 30 to 40 SOEs. I think you've highlighted, you brought in the concept of profit, and I think there is also this narrative that 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 one that issue with privatizing SOEs is that they will be profit led and profit motivated. But I think one must look beyond profit. For sure, profit is important, and the kind of revenue that it will generate to the state can definitely have a great impact. In our case, on debt repayments. So that I think that message has to go out to the people. But something else that I would like to add, Anuka, is the importance of value addition that privatization brings, especially if you can bring in international players. Let's look at 2000 to 2005, where we had, I would say, let's look at 1994 to 2005, where we had international players like Emirates, Maersk, international port operators coming in. The kind of value addition they brought and created, and even to this day, it is a significant driver of our growth and the kind of value addition that we create as a country, right? So I think most importantly, people miss this point because they just think from a profit perspective. But the spillover effects and the kind of accelerate as an accelerator of growth privatization brings is significant. And one you spoke of Air India, right? I think it was a given consensus, especially in India, that the state should not run the airline, right? I think we need that kind of consensus amongst people. I think as I said, we've been hopping around and running around the mulberry bush for too long. I think this crisis is the best example to once and for all, get rid of all our SOEs. And of course, it has to be done in a very transparent manner, where there is accountability, where you also maintain the highest level of governance, because only then can you attract international players. Only then can you attract the best companies to come and run your organizations. So I think that's another important point that we should probably carry uh, as well.
Of course, Vimanga. So, my intention was to bring this conversation towards privatization. So, I think there is a narrative built around privatization, and also there can be positive and negative comments made on it. But however, throughout the world, around Asia, we've seen the benefits of privatization. Even in Sri Lanka, especially in the telecom industry, I think we've seen the benefits of privatization, and Sri Lankan Airlines also at one point saw the benefits of privatization. But however, I would like to also tap into this topic of the negative connotation with the word of privatization. It's a very sensitive topic. Uh,
For
uh,
sure, I think privatization is generally a bad word, right? I mean, that's been our experience
yes.
when we approach this topic, throughout as well. So
Yeah. So that's what I think Advocata also has been trying to tackle for so long, that privatization, even though it is looked at in a very negative or a very different perspective, we're trying to change it. We're trying to say that the benefits that people and the country can gain is much wider than just looking at it as selling of national assets. So, Vimanga, if we touch upon this aspect of privatization being called as selling national assets, what is your opinion? What do you have to say to our audience? What do you think should be the change of thought process of Sri Lankans to approach privatization and look beyond selling national assets?
right. I think I think as you said, this I mean, I do have issues with also the perception that you look at selling national assets to be a bad thing, because what in reality, you have your biggest returns is when you sweat your assets. And what you can see is the government has been a terrible organization when it comes to sweating assets, right? They've not used these assets. They've literally, I mean, we probably have a few SOEs that probably make profits, but that's because they're monopolies and they dominate the sectors they're in. So the state as an organization that runs commercial interests has been terrible in performance. All indicators, Advocatas report, global indicators, all. I mean, it's proven and tested. So I think we should change that narrative and understand that it is important to sell these assets, because right now I think we're in dire need, and we need to build our reserves, and we need to fund essential imports. So for sure there is a much bigger need for these assets to be sold. And more than that, look at it again in terms of a way to attract, as I said, competition, skill set, be part of global networks, because only then can, by opening up, by allowing international players to be stakeholders in our assets, can we become part of global growth, and global value chains. So at least my message is really, don't look at it as looking selling assets, because selling assets is actually a way of making, bringing in returns to the nation. um, and I think I must add another important thing. One of I think if you look at Sri Lanka, one of our greatest accelerators of growth, and also, and we have, a I would say, very competitive national players who've entered the global, in manufacturing, and in other sectors. So a reason for that was, you had the free trade zones, right? In the 70s, we explored with the concept of free trade zones, and it worked for us. That is because, once again, we created assets and we sweated those assets, and we allowed individual players to thrive. So I think it is high time we relook at that model as well. And the BOI running free trade zones, I mean, that is outdated. It is not relevant to the 21st century. So another key reform, I think, we can probably do is, uh, for 2023 and going forward, I think, is to also prioritize on the heart of Sri Lanka's growth story, which is free trade zones, and start getting in private players, especially East Asian private players, to manage our free trade zones. And these players have skin in the game. They are part of global chains. They will bring in the business we need, right? So that, I think, is a fundamental thing. So all of these methods are basically ways to sweat our assets and make money. And this is a thing that the state has been terrible at. So this is why I keep saying that what is important is making sure that this is a private sector led initiative. uh, that once we privatize, once we create a sense of stakeholdership and let private players come in and be part of these enterprises, what will happen is we will innovate. So I think fundamentally it's important that you actually get these reforms, that this kind of reforms implemented. Again, some of these can be actually second tier reforms, because I think, as I said initially, I think the most fundamental ones, the first tier reforms, uh, are going to be the kind of reforms that will achieve macroeconomic stabilization. But again, tier two reforms like privatization are really essential. I think there are other reforms, once again, which we can probably speak a bit towards the end of the podcast. But these are essential reforms, if we are looking, and if we really want to create a prosperous future.
Yeah. So Vimang, I was necessarily also thinking, like when you mentioned about free trade zones and also like our export sector, when you brought in that, I was wondering whether we've only come this far since late 90s, early 2000s, and we've not made necessary improvements on our exports, on our trade sector. We've just moved on in terms of different kinds of development aspects, but we've not improved the sector that we have income through. So this sector, the export sector, also can benefit out of privatization. So talking about privatization, since we discussed that topic extensively, I would like to summarize few things Vimanga mentioned. So privatization of state-owned enterprises is important because it reduces our deficits, the deficits of the government, and this reduction of deficits then leads to less debt, and also we can reduce the amount of debt service repayments that we have to do. So this step will necessarily reduce the burden on the taxpayer, and basically the taxpayer in terms of business activities and also in terms of households and personal income. So this can stimulate growth. So stimulating growth is should be our main important focus, and working towards economic prosperity is should be our target for the year 2023. So when talking about the year 2023, we've spoken about privatization, we've spoken about state-owned enterprise reforms, and also we've tapped onto the sector of trade and what we need to improve. So then can we also look into the other reforms as a country, what we need to do in 2023, the next step of reforms, in your opinion?
So, Anuka, I think, as I said, probably priority will be the tier one reforms, and then we will have to prioritize tier two reforms. A key part of that, I think, is building an ecosystem where the private sector, small and medium enterprises, corporations, and business as a whole can thrive. I think that is fundamental. So I think we've always had this wish list, right?
Yeah.
And we've been speaking about this wish list for decades. I think, again, this is the right time to actually start implementing this. So I think, as a nation, we need to adopt the implementation mindset, and this implementation mindset should take priority for 2023. And I will just quickly elaborate on a few of those. I think, probably a place to start is with the regulation, because if you look at, I mean, Advocata has been speaking on how hard it is to set up, a small organization like a sole trader, the kind of time and documentation it requires. then it only gets worse for business for private limited companies going for, I mean, along that ladder. So reforming that process, and then there are lots of issues and regulations when it comes to investment, when it comes to transfer of capital flows, uh, approvals, even in the export sector. So I think we've spoken about these, and there are lots of policy outputs written over time. I think now what we need again is that implementation mindset and getting these reforms implemented. So a key reform, I think, must be deregulation. This will supplement the kind of reforms like SOE reforms that will take place in the country. I think a third key important element is really, if we want to achieve growth, is again, this is part of a liberalization process where we will try to look at things like skilled immigration, and having a more open mindset when it comes to our nation's immigration policy, and then which should also be supplemented by an open investment policy, where it will be very easy for investors to come and invest. And then, I mean, we mustn't forget the port city exists now. I think regardless of the debates we have, we should utilize it and get in the kind of investments and get the project going. So I think there has to be a wholesome and a coordinated effort with these reforms. So a second key important thing with reforms is that interdepartmental coordination, and I think this has to come at a governmental level. I think I must also emphasize another key important reform that we've probably not discussed or been ignoring, is our relationship with India, and the kind of market, the 1.23 billion market that we have been ignoring for the longest time. So I think expanding and developing our economic relationship with India has to be is going to be important, especially because from a very business perspective, it'll also help our entrepreneurs, our businesses, to enter and get access to a 1.3 billion market, and this is going to be a key driver. So I think there are a wholesome set of reforms that is before us. So we have this wish list, and I think right now what we need is to prioritize that, understand that with macroeconomic stabilization, you need a network coordinated action plan for the implementation of these reforms. I think this has to be the kind of precondition for 2023. And I think it is very important that policymakers, government, and also the public as a whole start supporting these reforms, because these are the only ways in which you can come out of this crisis and divert the nation and the economy towards a path of growth.
Of course, Vimanga. Like you said, we've been having this wish list of reforms that we've been constantly talking about, mentioning, and also Advocata has been producing a lot of work around these areas. We've been talking about a set of reforms, and also we've been talking about the interests that we have as a regional member. So I think it's time that we use all these connections, all these opportunities, and like I said, a crisis should not go into waste. It should be utilized, and the reforms should be made in order to make the future of this country prosperous, and hand over a blissful country to the next generations. So it is important that in 2023 we all resolve, and our one and only resolution for our country and our economy should be that we should support the reforms, and we should make sure that it's done. And I think the Reset Now podcast was a reason for having this podcast on the dawn of this year, is to give you hope and positivity about the reform process that we need to carry on in this year, in the next 12 months, and bring our country to a point that bring our country to the path of economic prosperity. So, on that note, I would like to thank Vimanga for joining us today on our Reset Now podcast. I think this was a very fruitful discussion, and our goal at the end of the day to give positivity, hope for our economy, for our country has conveyed. And also, thank you everyone for listening and watching us today. Let's see you on a later day soon.
You can listen to this podcast on Anchor, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And remember to follow us on all our social media platforms for more exciting content. See you in the next episode.